Thank you so much for inviting me. It's a pleasure and an honor for me to be here. I changed my speech hundreds of times until 15 minutes ago. So I'll just try to share with you some thoughts about the topic of the Ignatian roots of the reform of the Church, according to Pope Francis. So we just celebrated the 5th anniversary of the election of Pope Francis. How has the Church changed in these 5 years? This seems to have been the question which many have frequently sought to answer, bringing together analysis and different opinions. Nevertheless, it risks being a question that puts a fact in the shadows. The Church lives a continuous change because it is on a journey with the history of men and women. So every pontificate has had an influence on its times and has contributed in one way or another to the journey of the Church in the world. Like every pontiff, Francis felt himself called to express his own gaze on the world and the Church. In particular, Pope Francis' proposal is prophetical. That is, realized by those who know how to bestow to the movement of time its true relationship with God's plan. So this pontificate has prophetic consistency, which is grounded on discernment. I'll try to explain why and how. Some commentators have wanted to read the changes in the course of Francis' pontificate with an exclusively sociological perspective, and they have flattened the theme of reform on the question of the reform of the Roman Curia. It's a very short-sighted perspective. Francis' objective is that of launching the internal reforms of the Curia, but not that of bringing them all and right away to completion. Humility prevents him from imagining himself as a Don Quixote of reform. That is like, as he said, cleaning the Egyptian Sphinx with a toothbrush. And it's one of his many eloquent images. This is the ironic observation that has guided him since the beginning. Already at the beginning of the pontificate, Francis affirmed that the reform of the Curia could only be the expression of a profound interior reform of the Church. As I can testify to the question that I posed to the Pope a year ago in an informal moment in Santa Marta, if he wanted to reform the Church, the Pope responded, no. And he just said that he simply wants to put Christ ever more at the center of the Church. Then he would be the one to do the necessary reforms. So the reformer is not Francis, it's Christ. He wants to put Christ at the center of the Church. This way he could do the reforms needed. Now, 5 years after his election, Pope Francis decided to publish his third apostolic exhortation, Gaudete et exultate, rejoice and be glad. It, as explicitly stated in the subtitle, has as a topic the call to holiness in the contemporary world. The pontiff launches a naked, essential message that indicates what it contains. The very meaning of Christian life, that is, in the language of St. Ignatius Loyola, to seek and to find God in all things, following the direction of his invitation to the Jesuits. Curet primo Deum, which is not easy to translate, but is the short version of a longer expression, longer sentence that we read in our Formula Institutia number 1. Let each make sure to have before his eyes, always, before anything else, God. Curet, take care. Primo, first. Deum, God. This is the real reform of the Church. This is the heart of every reform, personal and ecclesial. Putting God in the center, as Francis wrote in Gaudete et Exultate. The Lord, he wrote, asks everything of us, and in return he offers us true life, the happiness for which we were created. He wants us to be saints and not to settle for a bland and mediocre existence. This is a new formulation of the old principium et fundamentum we read at the beginning of the spiritual exercises of Ignatius Loyola, number 21st. So in a sense, Gaudete et Exultate is kind of a paraphrases of the spiritual exercises. We found a lot of quotation, hidden quotations. So here we can see the real roots of this pontificate. It is not a coincidence that Cardinal Bergoglio, when he became Pope, chose the name Francis. He did not do it only to highlight the gospel ties with the poor and the least, but he did it because he feels the mission of Francis of Assisi is his, rebuilding the church, beginning, like the Saint of Assisi, as the bricklayer who rebuilds a chapel, physically. His reform is, and it needs to be, essentially a spiritual and pastoral reform, grounded in the experience of God, with the personal encounter with God. God first. Francis' pontificate has its heart in the Ignatian discernment. It is an interior attitude that pushes him to be open and to find God everywhere he wants to be found. He wants to be found everywhere. I like a book I bought years ago in California, just for the title. I never read this book. Sorry. But I was kept by the title. Searching for God in all wrong places. Searching for God in all wrong places. There are no wrong places for God. So everywhere he wants to be found. And not only in the already well-known and well-defined perimeters. Above all, he is not afraid of the ambiguity of life, and he faces it with courage. He's not afraid of ambiguities, the ambiguities of real life, which is not in black and white. The fact that around the Pope, energy fields of attraction and repulsion, negative and positive, are created. This Pope is electric. And so the fact itself that around the Pope, this kind of energy fields of attraction and repulsion, negative and positive, are created, in which Francis is the catalyst of those positive that are inside and outside of the church, demonstrates that this discernment is taking place. Just let's think about the mobilization for peace in Syria, and we are talking about Syria today. Or the effects, as we saw, of the encyclical Laudato Si. He aggregates the good and forces the evil to reveal itself. This is why we see around him so many oppositions, hatred even against him. Where was this hatred before? It was just there. But he is forcing this bad feelings, the bad spirit is pushing the bad spirit outside, from inside. He squeezes the evil from inside. And this occurs outside of, but also within the church. And so with the good spirit, squeezing the good spirit from inside the church, but again, even outside the church. Francis is putting the church into the spiritual exercises. This is what he's doing. And it is by no means an accident that the Pope he decided actually to experience the feast of the chair of St. Peter last February 22nd, not in a solemn celebration in St. Peter's accompanied by choruses of Tu es Petrus, but closed in silence. That very day, February 22nd, chair of St. Peter. He decided to stay closed in silence in spiritual exercises with the Roman Curia at Ariccia, nearby Rome. Pope Francis is a Jesuit, and the experience of the spiritual exercises has shaped his life. So let's take a step back in the past and recall the figure of another Pope who will help us to understand Francis better. After the death of Julius III on April the 9th, 1555, Marcello Cervini, Cardinal of the Basilica di Santa Croce, was elected Pope. He had been one of the papal legates at the Council of Trent, where he had the chance to get to know the Jesuit theologians. From the beginning of the council, some Jesuits were present as experts, as theologians. We have a letter in which Ignatius gives instructions to the Jesuits about how to behave at the council. He asked them to behave, of course. And so the interesting thing is that he does not enter in all any of doctrinal or theological issues, but he was concerned about the living witness that the Jesuit would give while there. So in this letter is nothing about doctrine, but there is a lot about witnessing, a living witness that the Jesuit would give while there. This already gives us an idea of how Ignatius intended to reform the church, or how he intended the reform of the church. For him, it was not so much a matter of reforming the structure as to reform the people from within. For example, he recommends that following in his own path, they go visit the sick people in hospitals, confessing and consoling, he wrote, the poor, bringing some material help if possible, and having them pray. This is the suggestion. Marcello Cervini argued that the reform of the church could not only be founded on the removal of some abuses, but had to be radical. That is, it had to start from the self-renewal of the Pope and the Curia. This is what he wrote, Cardinal Cervini. The reform had to start from the self-renewal of the Pope and the Curia. On his election, Ignatius, in letters addressed to the whole Society of Jesus, revealed his thinking on what he intended the reform of the church to be. From these letters, we can infer that Ignatius' desire was to have a pope who have done the entire spiritual exercises. It may well be that at the Council of Trent and then Cardinal Marcello Cervini, being in contact with the Jesuits Lainez, Father Lainez and Father Salmeron, had come to know and maybe even done, at least in part, the exercises. In any case, his disposition was perfectly in accordance with them. Ignatius was convinced that starting from the reform of one's own life and keeping one's eyes fixed on the poor and humiliated Christ, one could not but necessarily achieve a structural reform of the Church. And this is what Francis really wants, like Pope Marcellus II. He simply wants to put Christ ever more at the center of the Church. Then he would be the one to do to do the necessary reforms. Pope Francis is a Jesuit pope, and his idea of the reform of the Church corresponds to that of Ignatius, which is quoted many times in the apostolic exhortation, Gaudete et Exultate. The reform is indeed a spiritual process that also affects by connaturality the ecclesial structure. Ignatian spirituality is the dark chamber of deep, we could also say chemical, elaboration of Bergoglio's experiences as bishop first and then as a pope. Francis is a product of the spiritual exercises, and his vision of church reform is rooted in the reform of life, which is the outcome of the exercise. So these are the roots of this reform. So I'm going to try to find some characteristics of this reform. And the first one maybe is that the reformer is one who emptied himself. As he said, the reformer has to empty himself. If we read what Francis has said of the Jesuit, we understand why he feels that he ought to empty himself. In his homily at the Jesuit Church in Rome on January the 3rd, 2014, he said, "The heart of Christ is the heart of a God who, out of love, emptied himself. Each one of us, as Jesuits, who follow Jesus, should be ready to empty himself. We are called to this humility, to be emptied beings." This is what said to us. The reform for Francis is rooted in this emptying of self. If it were not so, if it was only an idea, an aspirational project, the fruit of one's own desires, even if good, it would become yet another ideology of change, and we don't need it. Being empty for him means also to apply discernment to himself, not just to the other, to the church, to himself. He's able to discern the Spirit inside of the soul. So, in applying the discernment on himself, he ended up to consider himself as a sinner, a person able to make faults. It's the fruit of the first week of the spiritual exercises. God works in us even amid faults and failings. Francis wrote recently to the Chilean bishops after reading the report by Monsignor Scicluna. I lived all the story because I was there in Chile, following him in all trips. So I was there. That was a terrible experience for me personally. And I consider the letter Pope Francis wrote to the Chilean bishops as a revolutionary. I recommend you to read it. He wrote, I just quote a passage, "As for my own responsibility," but remember what I said to you before about the spiritual exercises, to empty himself, the necessity to be empty and to recognize sins and failures and faults. "As for my own responsibility, I acknowledge, and I want you to faithfully convey it that way, that I have made serious mistakes in the assessment and perception of the situation, especially because of the lack of truthful and balanced information. Right now, I ask forgiveness from all those I offended, and I hope to be able to do so personally." You know that he's going to meet three abused persons at the end of this month. "In the coming weeks," he said. "In the meetings I will have with representatives of the people who were interviewed." With this letter, we could say that we face a change of the meaning itself of the expression His Holiness. Holy Father referred to a pope. This is the meaning of reform for Francis, and this has a big and will have a big impact on the church. So he is holy, but through his own faults, mistakes, and sin. In Lima, again, I was there. I rejoiced when I heard this Angelus in January 21st in Plaza de Armas in Lima. So once he gave a peculiar description of the church. I want to quote it. "Zacchaeus was a short man. The disciples who fell asleep when Jesus told them they should pray. Mary Magdalene, a public sinner. Paul, a persecutor of Christians. Peter, who denied him and was then made Pope, yet he denied Jesus." And we could go on with the list. Jesus wants us as we are, just as he wanted his friends, with their defects, desiring to correct them, yes, but as they are. That's how the Lord loves you. This is the Church of Francis, sinners, made by sinners. Those instead who would imagine a Don Quixote or a holy Superman like Deus ex machina may be disappointed. The Pope knows that mistakes can be made, and he has the humility to recognize them and to try other roads. Then he tests the quality of the processes. Francis doesn't believe in a pret-à-porter, ready-to-wear solutions. Reform is being carried out step by step. To say it in another way, generally speaking, you can state that this is a pontificate of seeds. The quantity of seeds it is spreading is broader and greater with respect to that of the first harvest. Second point is the non-ideological discernment. Bergoglio once observed that in Ignatius' life is found the internal coherence of his project. He wrote that when he was a Jesuit provincial. So he spoke about the internal coherence of the project of Ignatius. But what is exactly the Ignatius project? A theoretical vision ready to be applied to reality, to force it in its parameters? An abstraction to be applied to reality? What's the Ignatius project? Nothing of the kind. He wrote his project is not a planning of functions, nor are an assortment of possibilities. His project consists in making explicit and concrete what he, Ignatius, had experienced in his inner world. In light of this, the question about what is Pope Francis' program does not make sense. The Pope has no clear and distinct ideas to apply to reality. But he proceeds based on his spiritual experience and prayer that he shares in dialogue and consultation with others. We cannot practice discernment on ideas, even ideas of reform, but on what is real, on histories, as he told me in the first interview in 2013. So in the concrete history of the Church. For Francis, realities are always more important than ideas, as he wrote in Evangelii Gaudium. Therefore, the starting point is always historical and means first to recognize thus that Dios trabaja y labora por mí en todas cosas creadas sobre la haz de la tierra. God works and labors for me in all things created on the face of the earth. Spiritual Exercises number 236. In the last 5 years, Pope Francis has unfollowed a defined strategy which has been dreamt up in a bureaucratic ivory tower. He hasn't applied an abstract or theoretical 5 years plan. He makes his decisions in the chapel, not in the office, also because he doesn't have an office. Some choices, even important ones, he makes not because they were planned, but because he perceived in his prayer that were necessary. His ability to surprise comes from here, but also his ability to go straight, feeling neither the strength of the wind inside nor the media pressure outside. He feels them, but is not susceptible to them. In Meditaciones para Religiosos, a series of reflections written when Bergoglio was provincial of the Argentine Jesuits, he explains the dynamic of the process with spiritual and practical understanding. He uses a very effective image from the Gospel. He wrote, "We are encouraged to build the city." We are among Augustinians, city of God. We are encouraged to build the city, but perhaps we need to tear down the model we were drawing in our head. We must take courage, he wrote. When he wrote that, he was 40. We must take courage and let God chisel our face, even if this means smoothing out some of our tics that we thought were gestures. So the pars destruens, which consists in doing away with the model, is functional for leaving the chisel in the hands of God. But a pars destruens is needed. During the interview I did with him in 2013 for Civilta Cattolica, he gave a key definition of the Jesuit, and hence of himself, of course. A person whose thought is incomplete, whose thought is open. And again, the Jesuit always thinks again and again, looking to the horizon toward which he must advance, with Christ at the center. In this sense, Pope Francis is a man whose thoughts are incomplete and open. Can you imagine a pope who is able to say that? My thoughts are incomplete, my thought is open. But this is what he asked for the Jesuit. If you want to be a Jesuit, okay, be ready to be incomplete. Which is not exactly the image of the Jesuit he had for years. And this requires, as himself affirms in the course of the interview, On the one hand, research, creativity, and generosity, and on the other hand, humility, sacrifice, and courage. And these attitudes are very important for difficult times. When we live difficult times, we need research, creativity, generosity, but also humility, sacrifice, and courage. Being men and women of discernment means for the Pope to be men and women of incomplete thought, of open thought. The road that Francis intends to follow is truly open for him, and he refuses easy conclusions. The journey reveals itself by walking. Thus, at times, he opens discourses without closing them right away, or drawing from them hurried implications, leaving space for dialogue and debate. Among those, we have, for example, the question, 3 questions he put in Evangelii Gaudium. The conversion of the papacy, what does it mean? He talked about the conversion of the papacy. We are discovering it, even reading the last letter he wrote to the Chilean bishops, for example, or what he said about the Petrine ministry during the synod. But he just put it there. So living, trying to help people to think about it. So the conversion of the papacy, the discipline of the sacraments, Evangelii Gaudium number 104, the role of women, again, Evangelii Gaudium. On this journey, the Pope does not believe that a definitive or complete word on every question which affects the Church should be expected from his teaching. In fact, neither the Pope nor the Church, he wrote on Evangelii Gaudium, have a monopoly on the interpretation of social realities or the proposal of solutions to contemporary problems. So there is this deep sense of incompleteness, evangelical incompleteness in the Francis vision. Third point, brief one. Discernment, Ignatian discernment, the roots of the reform of Pope Francis, is a process which needs imagination. In the talk Francis gave to the Jesuits writer of Civilta Cattolica, my review, when he received us in audience for the issue number 4000 last year in February, he said, we need to penetrate ambiguity. We need to enter in there as the Lord Jesus did, assuming our flesh. Rigid thought is not divine because Jesus has assumed our flesh, which is not rigid except after death. So you are rigid if you are dead. The direct consequence of this need to penetrate ambiguity is the following sentence. This is why he said, I like poetry so much. And when it is possible for me, I continue to read it. Poetry is full of metaphors. Interesting. Understanding metaphors helps to make thought agile, intuitive, flexible, acute. It's an amazing speech he gave to us. It's online, you can read it. Whoever has imagination does not become rigid, has a sense of humor, and he said that in Gaudete et Exultate, always enjoys the sweetness of mercy and inner freedom. He even quoted some verses of Baudelaire. Then I learned by the ambassador of Argentina to the Holy See, who was a student of him, that he was used to quote this verse also to them, teaching literature, because Bergoglio, as you probably know, taught literature in the high school when he was a regent. And so he quoted the same verse to us, verses of Baudelaire on Rubens. So quoted this verse, there were there where he, Baudelaire writes that, sorry about my French, but la vie afflue et s'agit sans cesse, comme l'air dans le ciel et la mer dans la mer. Life moves and whirls incessantly, like the air and the sky and the tide and the sea. Yes, life is fluid and is agitated relentlessly, like the air and the sky and the sea and the sea. This is Pope Francis. The thought of the Church must recover genius and understand ever better how men and women are understood today to develop and deepen right teaching. And this genius helps us to understand that life is not a painting in black and white, it's a painting in colors. Some clear and other dark, some soft and other vivid. But in any case, nuances prevail. And this is the space for discernment, the space in which the Spirit agitates the sky like the air and the sea like the water. Fourth point, a process, discernment, as a process that faces limits, conflicts, and resistances. Bergoglio is not a maximalist. He does not believe in rigid idealism, nor in ethicism or spiritual abstractions. Limits, conflicts, and problems are an integral part of our spiritual journey. The relationship between desire and limit is realistic, humanizing. It highlights our smallness and opens us to the greatness, even greater, of God. Limits. The principle that sums up his view about limits is a motto, a Latin motto, which is non coerceria maximo contineri tamen a minimo divinum est, which can be translated as not to be limited by the greatest and yet to be contained in the tiniest. This is the divine, and he quoted this motto in Gaudete et Exultate. It's, for me, just amazing. It's breathtaking. So, not to be limited to the greatest, and yet to be contained in the tiniest. This is the divine. The motto is part of a long literary epitaph composed by an anonymous Jesuit in honor of Ignatius of Loyola. Hölderlin liked it so much that he affixed it as a motto to his Hyperion. And we know how much Bergoglio loves Hölderlin's work. So much so that he cited the German poet, the Hölderlin, in the original 2 days after his election as he greeted the cardinals in the Clementine Hall. So he had in mind Hölderlin talking with the cardinals at the very beginning of his pontificate. This is a thought that accompanied Bergoglio at least since the years in which he was provincial superior, as documented in an essay titled Conducir en lo grande y en lo pequeño, perhaps one of his most significant, given that the Pope cited it several times during the interview I did with him. What does Pope Francis mean by quoting this epitaph? That within the horizon of the kingdom of God, the infinitesimal, the little one, the tiniest, can be infinitely large, while infinity instead can be a cage. It's a paradox. So infinite can be a cage, but the smaller place can be big enough for you. It seems a paradox, but not for God who became man. The great reform project is realized in the slightest gesture, the little step. God is hidden in what is small and what is growing, even if we are incapable of seeing it. The perception of the divine enclosed in the smallest space and not restricted in the larger one is therefore a fundamental criterion. Resistances. A remarkable temptation is that under the appearance of good, which has the effect of pulling the church away from reality, from history, which is one of its most disastrous and pervasive effects. This is one of the most remarkable temptation. We experience it when figures, sometimes even bishops and cardinals, arise who seem to want to replace the Pope to defend the doctrine, or when they sow uncertainty and confusion, even letting us believe that orthodoxy is in danger. These temptations generate distortion because the opium of nostalgia, as he wrote many years ago when he was a Jesuit, so characteristic of the traditionalists, which distracts us from the creativity of a faithful memory, is blinded. Opium of nostalgia is blind. Francis, like all the popes, has generated resistances outside and inside of the church. Why? The deep root of this pontificate is faith that God is active and at work in the world. And this is the Ignatian vision. Some believe that God has retreated, that by now the world is lost to evil, and that the church herself must retreat from the world and its dust to keep herself pure and beautiful. For some, Catholicism must be conserved as a minority of the pure, who preserve doctrine in a jewel box, and who are not contaminated in the world, in history, reality. Francis sees fluidity between the public square and the church, between ecclesia and agora, not hostility. For him, the church must be always open to the public square, to let the people enter, yes, but above all, to let Christ go out without locking him in. The vision of Christ, who wants to go out of the temple for his mission, is opposite to the idea of the Christianity made up of a small group of the pure. For Francis, the gospel is the talent to spend and to make it bear fruits. The church must take to the street, get dirty, and perhaps hard. The resistances attack and contrast this vision of the church, understood as a torch that walks and goes everywhere, light as a torch. They would like her only as a lighthouse that stays put there where she is, in her static condition. She attracts and comforts, but she does not accompany. The resistances to Francis are resistances to the Council, Second Vatican Council. What is striking is eventually that while so far the opposition was basically, in the past, grammatically correct, that is, capable of criticizing actions to the pontiff in office, safeguarding, however, his figure and ministry, now instead it often appears completely ungrammatical, that is, not able to speak ecclesial language, and even divisive on the decisive questions, such as ecclesiastical authority or the liturgy. That has even involved people, priests and bishops, and has required the intervention of the press office of the Holy See to correct wrong interpretation. The last point, and I will conclude with this: tension between spirit and institution. To conclude, it must be said that for Pope Francis, the reform of the Church is experiencing a strong and fruitful dialectic tension between spirit and institution. In his apostolic exhortation Evangelii Gaudium, he wrote, "The Church has to accept this unruly freedom of the Word, which accomplishes what it wills in ways that surpass our calculations and ways of thinking." There is a dialectical and intra-ecclesial tension in Francis' remark regarding spirit and institution. And this is typical of the Jesuit charisma. One never denies the other, spirit and institution, but the former, institution, the spirit, must animate the latter, the institution, in an effective way to counter what Francis called the ecclesial introversion. Actually, it's a quotation by St. John Paul II, which is a great temptation, the ecclesial introversion. The Pope also wrote, "I do not want a church concerned with being at the center, and which then ends by being caught up in a web of obsessions and procedures." He then says that the church is a people of pilgrims and evangelizers transcending any institutional expression, however necessary. That this is Evangelii Gaudium number 111. Finally, worth noting is this fruitful tension between the church as a pilgrim people and as institution reflects two of the Pope Francis' favorite definitions of the church: the pilgrim people of God, Lumen Gentium, and the Holy Mother hierarchical church, Ignatius Loyola. The reform of the church for Francis is basically this: to ensure that the Holy Mother, the hierarchical church, is always the pilgrim people of God. What should you expect for the future of this pontificate? We will understand it in the passage of time, because, as the poet Antonio Machado said, "Se hace camino al andar." The path opens up along the way. Thank you.
Thank you very much for this. We have more or less 10 minutes for questions. If you can introduce yourself briefly.
Thank you. I'm Mike Canaris from Loyola University, Chicago. And my question is, in addition to the Ignatian charisms of incompleteness and imagination, you also see this pontificate marked by the contours of disponibilità, the willingness to let oneself be placed where the church or world most needs them. I see that as really interwoven in almost every gesture and writing of the Pope.
Yeah, that's true. That means to be obedient to the Holy Spirit. The question for me here is that we have to recognize where the Spirit leads us. And but before going to mission, we have to be able to discern, because God is just there. He's already there. This is the question. Sometimes we think that we have to bring God in places where He is not. And this is false, because He is everywhere. So He's able to be everywhere, to talk to everyone. Everyone has a spiritual life, for example. Sometimes it's hard to recognize it. So there are even non-believers who don't want to, or they are not able to recognize their spiritual life. But God talks with them. So they have a spiritual life, of course. So the grace of God is active. So God is everywhere, is active, is in the terms of Ignatius Loyola, He works as a worker in the world. So He's present there. So we have to be obedient not to our mission, the mission that we have in our mind. The first step is to be obedient to God where He is. And it's not easy sometimes to recognize Him. And for example, it's interesting that considering some reaction Pope Francis received, we can see that people far away from the church became interested in the gospel. Not just in Pope Francis. Pope Francis is a person who preaches the gospel. Once I talked with a pastor, Protestant pastor, who's of course not Catholic, and I asked him, why you like so much Pope Francis? His answer was, because he preaches the gospel. It's so simple. And so many people are attracted by him, but not because him, because the message that he's able to spread and to incarnate in a sense. So we have, we need to be able to discern the presence of God wherever he wants to manifest himself. And then we can start with our, we can work, we can do our missionary work. There's kind of a pastoral conversion, for example, which is extremely important. Has to be aware that God is already at work in his people. So when we talk, for example, I finish that here, about the theology of the people, you know, many are talking about the theology of the people. But for Francis, theology of the people is not the theology which has as an object the people, but it's theology made by the people. So the people is the subject. So the theologian has to listen how God is manifesting himself or manifested himself inside of the people. So this is kind of a dynamic.
Thank you so much. Really appreciate everything you have to say. I'm fascinated by this idea that Francis doesn't have a program or an agenda and that reality matters more than ideas. And I'm really intrigued by what you were saying in terms of Francis's goal to reform not structures, but people from within. However, my name is Marcus Mischer. I teach at Xavier University. I specialize in Catholic social thought. And so, as I was listening to you, I couldn't help but think of structural sin. And I was wondering, while it's great to focus on the reformation of individuals and the church from within, without attention to reforming structures, without analysis of those structural problems that are creating dehumanization, division, oppression, I wonder if this is, while very nice and nimble, inadequate and ineffective, given the evil spirits that you acknowledged are being put into the light, thanks to Francis. Well, how can we respond if we don't have some ideas for the structural change or the structures of grace waiting to be built?
Sure. We need to have plans, of course. And we have to remember that he was provincial of the Jesuits for years. And then he became bishop, so was able to plan. And he was the president of the Bishop Conference of Argentina. And now he's a pope. He's doing a lot of things. The question is that he always gives priority to the Holy Spirit. So he has ideas in his mind, of course. And but he doesn't want to set a plan before reading the reality. This is the difference. So it's not his goal is not to make plans caged into ivory tower, but he wants to talk with people and he wants to pray on the reaction, spiritual reactions he feels during his prayer. And then he set a plan, of course. So he decides which kind of reforms he needs to lead or to improve or to start as a process. But this is not something that he has in his own mind. It's something that is made reading the reality, listening to people. And he is able also to change plans. It depends on the considering the reactions and the feedbacks he receives. So this is the open thought. So, of course, this implies, of course, it implies to make plans and strategic plans and whatever. The question is how to prioritize the reforms and even its actions in general. So I think this is crucial because sometimes bishops build pastoral plans without reading the reality. And this is wrong, I mean, because pastoral plans comes from theology sometimes, not just by reading the reality. So what Pope Francis is doing is trying to be open to reality as much as he can. And without having too many a priori before doing things. This is why he also at Santa Marta, for example, not for because he likes a poor life, because the papal apartments are pretty poor and simple. The question is that in Santa Marta he's able to meet people very often, and so he can get suggestions, so he can read reality. And sometimes, as it happened in Chile, he could even say, I made a mistake. So he's able to change.
Thank you for your paper. I just want to ask you the tension that could be seen in Pope Francis between what is his rules, his office as Pope, I would say the objective part, and the munus as his gift, as a Jesuit, as you have well explained. So this tension, which is actual there, how much of being Pope is part of his Jesuit tradition that will disappear when another Pope will come, and how much of this is munus is touching, I would say, daring, touching the ministry of the papacy. So I see here an actualization of what St. John Paul II in Ut Unum Sint 95-96 was proposing at the time.
Mm-hmm. This is the topic for another conference, of course. And well, sure. I really believe that each pope responds to the needs of the church in a certain time. So when Pope Francis was elected, I was in St. Peter's Square. And when I heard the name of Georgium Marium, Annuncio vobis gaudium magnum, habemus papa, eminentissimum ac reverendissimum dominum Georgium Marium. I said, who is the other cardinal whose name is Giorgio Marium? Because for me it was absolutely impossible to think a Jesuit as a pope. And immediately the Cardinal Toran said, Santa Romana Ecclesia Cardinale Bergoglio. And then I had a stroke. Because I felt kind of an oxymoron. How can a Jesuit be a pope? And then I started to elaborate, to think deeper and longer about this topic. And I realized that the mission of the Jesuit is to be available to the universal mission of the church. And the most universal service of the church is the service made by Peter. So in a sense, we are living a special time. And probably the times we are living now need discernment. So probably Pope Francis is answering the request of the Holy Spirit for our times to be a Pope of discernment. So this, of course, has an impact on his ministry as Peter. This is a pontificate of discernment. And that probably is exactly what we need now, today. For the future, who knows? I have no idea. I can talk about the past, but we can talking about the Holy Spirit. We can talk just about the past, not the future, because future is a surprise. But no doubts that the Ignatian charism and the discernment have a deep impact on this pontificate, and probably will have in the life of the Church for the future.
Join me in thanking the
Thank you.